It's the week ending Saturday the 29th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen Jeremy Corbyn promising a green jobs revolution, UN delegates laughing at Donald Trump, and the unforgettable headline, Seal slaps kayaker in face with octopus. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Jamie Timson and Kari Wilkin. And starting the show this week is Kari. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think this is the week we ask, could World War III be started by Sweden?
尊敬的中国游客，欢迎您来到瑞典。为了避免文化冲突，以下有些建议。例如，我们不在历史建筑物外拉屎。但您要是手上流了点大便。
That was, of course, a clip from the Swedish satirical show Swedish News, broadcast this week on SVT. Kari, you did offer us an alternative clip, which was an English dub of the Chinese dub of an original Swedish sketch. We decided to go with that one, but still, could you make it a little bit clearer, please? What on earth is going on?
You don't get it? Basically, it's a row that stems back to this skit that appeared on this Swedish satire show. And it's telling Chinese people how they should behave to avoid cultural clashes when they visit Sweden, for instance, by not pooing outside and by not eating dogs. It was dubbed over in Mandarin and then uploaded to a Chinese video sharing site, Youku. And this all basically started earlier this month when there was a big row, when footage emerged of a Chinese family being evicted from a hotel lobby in Stockholm after trying to check in 14 hours early.
Right.
And
ejected?
They wanted to stay in the hotel lobby for 14 hours until their room was available, and the staff said no.
And so the police were called?
Yes, because this family went berserk. You know, they were throwing themselves on the floor, shouting, "This is killing, this is killing," and just completely overreacted, as did the Swedish police. They then carried them out and apparently later dumped them at a metro station. China was outraged. The regime called it a brutal mistreatment and demanded an apology from the Swedish government. And footage of the incident was posted on Chinese social media and triggered a very mixed response.
Okay,
but obviously...
But so what? I mean,
yeah,
this is all very entertaining, but I mean, it all sounds quite micro, doesn't it?
And then this row has escalated because of this slightly misjudged satirical show on Swedish TV, and which the Chinese government has said is a gross insult, and again demanded an apology. It's warned its nationals not to travel to Sweden.
I really don't understand how TV works outside of China today. I don't think the state necessarily gets to write the jokes.
It was a pretty obnoxious skit.
It's a clearly racist skit.
And it was shown on
not
the national broadcast. Not the
responsibility of the Swedish government, though.
It was shown on the national broadcast at SVT, so... But yes.
They will, of course, claim that they were satirically being racist, which obviously doesn't really survive the Mandarin dub very well.
But there's been calls for a boycott on Swedish brands such as IKEA and H&M and Volvo. On Monday, Chinese hackers posted insulting comments on the Facebook pages of the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So this is escalating.
Okay, but escalating to what? Jamie, are there any long-term implications here, really?
World War III.
Right, okay, yeah, you're taking Kari's bait.
I think there's probably an interesting discussion to be had.
Well, let's have it, please.
Yeah, about whether or not this is the tipping point. I've read the description of what this podcast is about, so I'm building ourselves into this. It's not my first week here. About the kind of future and Chinese relations. You know, there's been so many, for the past 5-6 years, there's been so many articles talking about Chinese tourists and discussing, whether they're bad. And, now they are the world's top international tourism spenders. They spend more money than any other tourist group, countries from any tourist group. Right. But I think there is also the look at how we're going to now deal with the fact that China is flexing its muscles. There are many more Chinese people, overseas and doing things. And what the Western response, used to this kind of dominance, is going to be. You know, only this week, the guy from Google saying that there's going to be a split between the Western internet and the Chinese internet. And these relations, you know, things like, you know, they're not stepping down. They think they've been really insulted by Sweden, and they're not ready to just back away and be like, oh, well, okay, I guess it's a misunderstanding.
That's the thing. This row has really been brewing since the beginning of the year, when there was a much more serious diplomatic incident when Ji Minhao, who's a Hong Kong-based book publisher with Swedish citizenship, was seized from a train in China in front of 2 Swedish diplomats who were with him. And he was one of the 5 Hong Kong booksellers who vanished in 2015 and then later resurfaced. Chinese state media accused Sweden of orchestrating the kidnapping. This bookseller later said in a taped statement that he had been pressured by Sweden to leave China, but there's speculation that that was a forced confession. So this has all been brewing. Earlier this month, a visit by the Dalai Lama to Malmö, the Swedish city. Obviously, that also massively
this in
angered.
itself sounds like a satirical sketch.
It's ridiculous. We've had the Chinese embassy releasing a statement saying that China's been accused by Sweden of interfering in the Swedish election earlier this month.
Okay, so is it really about, as Jamie was just suggesting, Rebecca, the culture clash between China and everybody else? It's not necessarily about Sweden.
It's not necessarily about Sweden, but it is symbolically powerful that this is happening with Sweden, which, you know, obviously is seen as kind of a cradle of human rights, you know, almost to the point of, you know, they do receive criticism for being too soft on a human rights level, as opposed to China, which has obviously been the boogeyman of human rights for decades. So I think it's kind of a nice symbolic clash. But yeah, fundamentally, it's about the fact that China, you know, was for a long time a very kind of closed off country. It was very difficult as well for its citizens to travel freely, which is still why you see so many, you know, the whole stereotype of the Chinese tour group was because that was for a long time the only way the Chinese citizens could travel. But now we are seeing more freedom of movement, and we are going to see more culture clashes, which can also spill over into economic consequences, as we've seen with calls for boycotts.
But also, as you were going back to what you were saying about the symbolic side of it, Sweden was actually the first Western nation to establish official diplomatic relations with China in 1950. So I think
so soft.
Exactly, but I think it's reached the stage no one can get on with China anymore. They're just clashing. You know, this week you had Donald Trump accusing China of seeking to interfere in the upcoming US congressional elections.
It's my favourite news clip of the week was the reaction of that Chinese ambassador at the UN as he realised that he had to have a statement ready within 2 minutes.
So, you know, and Trump's made similar allegations in the past. So China is being accused of infiltrating elections in the same way as Russia, which also, you've got the new China and Russia is at the new superpower axis. It's almost like everyone is being forced to pick their sides now, which I think is what's really terrifying, particularly during a week when Russia and China together launched the biggest joint military exercises since the Cold War. This Swedish row may not seem so much in itself, but even Sweden, as you say, the ultimate sort of diplomatic country, is being forced to choose a side, and I think that's scary.
Will this be a turning point then? I mean, not this racist sketch on Swedish television, but this brewing conflict, do you think, Jamie, you know, especially between America and China and meddling in elections, will this be a turning point we look back on in 10 years' time and say, oh yeah, that's when it all started?
I think that it's certainly becoming much more prevalent. You know, you look at somewhere, you know, across the globe now, it seems like there are divides between Western-backed politicians and Chinese-backed politicians. For instance, in the Maldives recently had a very similar thing where the Chinese-backed president was kicked out. It does seem to be brewing in a sense of this, you know, China wanting soft power, particularly more recently we've spoken on this podcast about its soft power in Africa. There does seem to be a point where we have to say, okay, which way are we going to go? Are we going to go with the old guard of, you know, of the Western thing, or are we going to put our money behind China and the ways that China has flexed its muscles a bit? I think, though, that if you are a fan of globalization and you believe in the market as a ruling power, I don't see how you can turn yourself off from China, because they have the money, they have the means of ability. I mean, I'm not a big fan of globalization, but I think if you are, I think you have to say that their money is as good as anyone else's. So we have to welcome their influence.
And if we're able to trade with them, you know, with everyone chucking sanctions at each other, that's going to get harder.
Rebecca.
What this story really teaches us is that China is no longer happy to be tolerated. It is now demanding to be respected as well.
When it comes to sort of picking a side, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? You couldn't really, if you're faced by a choice between Chinese, Russian values and Western values, you couldn't really put to the electorate of any Western country that that's a real choice. No one's going to say, yes, let's be more like China. So the choice is about where we spend our money and how our government invests.
And about how willing we are to look the other way about human rights abuses in order to improve our economy. I mean, that's the thing, is that if they're willing to invest and build houses and build any kind of Chinese investment into infrastructure, into trains or whatever, are we willing to just accept that they are one of the worst in terms of human rights? So are we okay with that? And I think we have to make a decision as a country.
Theresa May seemed okay with it when she visited China in January.
Yeah, she seems okay with a lot of things, doesn't she?
And serious point, I know this sounds flippant, but I wonder how much of IKEA's furniture is actually made in China, because, I mean, that is a huge part of the Swedish economy, isn't it?
That's the thing. This may not result in, standard warfare, but it could result in economic conflicts on a huge scale. There was a study in 2013, actually, that found that between 2002 and 2008, countries with leaders who hosted the Dalai Lama, obviously not popular with China, saw an average fall in exports to China of about 17%. And obviously China is a massive consumer, so they can really hurt people economically if they disagree with them politically.
And physically.
Yeah, and physically with yes.
Rebecca, you're also not popular in China, but you are next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
To start the game, press XXX.
I mean, again, these girls know what they're doing, don't they?
You can't fault their work ethic. They're really going for it. I mean, look at that technique. Just a technique on that. Like, we can't see it all, but we can see enough to know that she's a pro. So I'm getting the services, but what I was telling Alex, the real trick of the trade isn't just spending all your money on prostitutes. It's spending all your money on prostitutes, letting them go home, and on the way home, shooting them dead and taking your money back. And that's what I do better than anyone else.
Wow. That was the video My Girlfriend Kills Hookers from the YouTube channel Spencer and Alex. Rebecca, we were talking about Fortnite last week. This week it's GTA 5. What's the story here?
Well, the story's not actually about Grand Theft Auto. That was slightly unfairly taken out of context for Spencer and Alex. It
was a satirical sketch. It was originally in Swedish.
They were playing the video game Grand Theft Auto, yes, where there is kind of a horrible trope of that video game for people to go around using the services of sex workers and then killing them. But the actual story this week is about sex education and how it relates to video games. It's been in the news this week that the government conducted a survey. They're doing consultation about reforms to sex education in schools. They did a survey of 17,000 people, and it's come out that only 13% of them were actually young people of school age. And it exposed this massive divide between what young people and older people want from sex education. Young people want to talk about gender, sexual identity, kind of hot button issues of recent years. And older people overwhelmingly think the most important subject is commitment and marriage. So we're kind of at a bit of an impasse. There's obviously a huge generational divide about what sex education should look like. And then now I can tell you're thinking, what's this got to do with Grand Theft Auto?
Thank you.
There was a really interesting article this week that ran in Mashable by Kellen Beck. They're doing a series about how sex education could be reformed by using digital media and particularly video games.
So what you're saying is that the older people who want sex education classes to be about marriage and commitment will be in any way appeased by a school saying, we've got a great idea, they're going to play video games.
Well, any reform to sex education has tended to be met with lots of outraged headlines in the right-wing press about they're getting 5-year-old boys to dress up as fairies and they're telling children about dildos. So there is obviously going to be pushback to any kind of reform. But I did think that the article, and there have been, other commentators have talked about this as well, there have been some really interesting studies and articles about the potential use of video games as an interactive way to teach sex education.
Okay, but you did choose that clip to illustrate how that can go wrong.
Well, yes,
when people learn about sex from video games, the results are not necessarily sex positive.
Exactly, and because what we hear about video games when we hear about it in the context of sex and sexuality is so often negative. We hear about female characters in skimpy armour, games like Grand Theft Auto where you can treat women disrespectfully and sexually disrespectfully as well. And then of course we always hear about online pornography and how it's ruining everyone, and sexting is
Kari, I can
everything.
tell you're desperate to jump in.
But
I should say as well, you've got children. children.
Yes,
How
I
would you
have.
feel about them getting their sex education using a video game?
God, as long as I
Partly.
don't have to do it. Having tried to explain sex education to them recently and then asked what they're taking from it, and they said the daddy provides the egg and the mummy hatches it, I think we need help.
I've played that game.
So yeah, I actually think all of those arguments about, you know, the effects of these violent, you know, explicit video games and online porn and everything, I think they're actually all good arguments for having targeted sex education videos. Kids are going to see this stuff anyway. Better that it's something that people, you know, informed people actually have control over how it's presented to them, rather than they just sort of, you know, go sneaking online and look at porn and that sort of thing.
Sex education as well is so poorly done in the UK. I have a friend who volunteers for the charity Brooke, who do like lots of young persons' sexual health. The stories that she tells when she talks about working with them, it's eye-opening to see the lack of information that young people get, and the lack of, you know, we bombard kids with advertising about lots of different things, and there's a really push to make them see the world and become part of the capitalism dynamic that exists. But when it comes to sex, we're hiding them and we're shielding them from taking things on themselves and being and engaging with their bodies and the concept of consent and all of those things that are so important. And then we wonder why you end up with situations or, you know, societies that are afraid to discuss sex. And in the end, you have things like Me Too and things like that, which I'm sure are born out of the fact that we're just not taught at a young age.
And there's also that age-old problem that the people who are talking to young people about sex are parents and teachers, the last people that kids want to talk to about sex. You know, this is a different way of doing it.
So, okay, what's the idea then? The teacher says, go home tonight and download this app, and on there play a game which is about how to achieve consent before embarking upon a sexual relationship, and then come back with any questions.
Not entirely different from that, actually. This has already been trialled. About 4 years ago, a team of people from Yale University developed a game. It was kind of like a graphic novel style choose your own adventure game that was about encouraging young people to make informed choices to do with sexual health, and they could choose to do certain things in certain situations, and it would show them the outcome for that character. And I think it would solve two problems we have with sex education. One, as Kari was saying, it's awkward and uncomfortable, and you just want to tune it out when you're 13, and you don't want to see your geography teacher like telling you all about checking your testicles and stuff. But the other thing being as well, the lack of interactivity, because if you remember being, you know, slightly different with older teens, but, you know, initial sex education, it sort of goes in one ear and out the other, because you don't know anything about sex. It means nothing to you. It's all theoretical. And one of the things that they touched on in this Mashable article was about how when most people think back to school sex education, the thing that stands out is the putting the condom on the banana. And I said it's not just because it's a funny image, you know, it's because it's the only interactive thing that you really do in sex education. And that's certainly something you could get in a safe way from a video game.
But to follow that logic through, the doing in learning about sex education would be simulating sex in the video game, wouldn't it? And that is something that parents, however liberal they are, might have a problem with.
It wouldn't necessarily be simulating sex, as in showing sex acts, but certainly.
But that's the equivalent of the condom over the banana.
But when you
would be to have an image of a penis and to be doing that.
I mean, obviously there are certain things about sex education that it would not be appropriate for. But the thing is, when you have sex education, they're not telling you how to have sex. You know, they're telling you about things like consent. But like, if you're not even in the pipeline of being anywhere near to having sex with anyone, it's easy to just kind of ignore those kinds of messages.
It's not a ludicrous thing to suggest that people should be aware of things like how to have sex under the age of 18. The idea that maybe perhaps we should be teaching things like female sexuality or like female sexual pleasure to kids, it's not the end of the world. In fact, actually, it would probably make people a bit more aware as they grow up. You know, of course, people are not going to be that...
In mainstream sort of centrist politics, everyone agrees with that. It seems to me another issue here which isn't being discussed, which is one of the reasons that sex and relationships education isn't progressing, particularly in state education, is because of the multicultural nature of our schools. And you have children from different backgrounds where their families insist upon, if not arranged marriage, then marrying within their own community, only having sex with the person you're marrying to, not talking about female sexuality. That is a real pressure that's happening.
And I remember a horrible debate that happened at my school where there was a kind of strong a cohort of Christians that were basically debating the rights and wrongs of homosexuality with gay members of the student body. And it was just something that was like, it happened or kind of organically in one of these classes. Looking back now, I'm just completely shocked that wasn't like stopped completely, because you were asking people to defend their identity and all of those things when they were so young. And I think, yes, you're right, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be on offer. Hopefully what we should do is provide it and then say, yes, of course, people can opt out.
But if you can take your children out of it, then making sure that everyone has the same level of understanding about consent isn't possible, is it?
But people can already opt out. It's just meaning that if you do opt to allow your children to learn about these things, that they're going to learn it better. And also not necessarily just from their point of view. You know, they can actually embody a different character and see what it feels like. You know, a boy can not see what it feels like to be a girl, but you know, get into that perspective much more. And hopefully that would teach much more respectful.
And hopefully it would come with educating the parents too. You know, hopefully the idea is if you are providing this thing and the kids do want to be involved because all of their friends are involved, hopefully then there'll be a point where the parents aren't like, oh no, we don't want you anything to do with this. They'll be like, oh, well, I guess, you know, maybe we should start listening to the people.
We are a world away from Granny's Garden, aren't we? But I'm just curious whether any of you have fond memories of educational games, because actually, you know, it's easy to say, oh, children are put off by playing educational games, but I do fondly remember quite a few of them that I played at school.
The only French lesson I ever enjoyed was when we pretended to go shopping. It was great.
Yeah, and I think there is a complete role for educational video games. And I think that if you told kids that their homework was to go and play a game, you know, at any age, they're going to be like, yeah, this is so much better than me writing like stuff down.
Jamie, that seems an appropriate moment to throw to you for your story of the week. What is it?
Should Auntie stop chasing viewers?
The greatest threat to our national security is terrorism.
I'm assigning you to the Home Secretary.
We must protect our way of life. That doesn't require apologising for the past.
That interview you did you mean what you said?
I don't need you to vote for me, only to protect me.
I'll do what's required.
She's got an agenda to heighten fear and to seize power. Don't mention this to anyone. This never happened.
That was a trailer for Bodyguard, the BBC drama that everyone in the UK has been talking about to such an extent that when I was on holiday, I even subscribed to a VPN so I could catch up on iPlayer, which, Jamie, means that it is ineligible for discussion on this show. If it's a story everyone's talking about, we can't talk about it.
See, and I'd read the description of the podcast before I came on here.
So you claim.
And I've missed out. Well, I think that The Bodyguard kind of accurately depicts something that Sir David Attenborough, I believe, was railing against this week. He was speaking to the Radio Times, 92 years old, and he said, I don't think the BBC does enough.
He's 92.
92 years old.
The Radio Times is 95, which is why he was speaking to them.
Ah, there you go. Good knowledge.
Well, I saw the cover in the newsagent. I've done my research.
Yeah. Good to hear. Speaking to the Radio Times, David Attenborough said, I don't think the BBC does enough arts and culture. It's not enough simply to say, well, it doesn't get a big enough audience. If you're a public service broadcaster, what you should be saying is we will show the broad spectrum of human interest. People of all kinds should be catered for. And I think the thought behind this, and certainly what you can see, is that there has been a shift with the BBC more recently to doing things like Bodyguard, and I would say, you know, Killing Eve, which is another excellent programme that everyone should watch, and less so about their cultural output and the things, the kind of niche things that a public service broadcaster should be going after. And now I would say that the reason for this is because of the kind of government intervention in the BBC and, you know, the kind of market of the BBC's output, and saying that it's got to be able to compete with Netflix, ITV, Channel 4, all of those things. And you can see that happening, and then choosing not to put on stuff that actually perhaps wouldn't get that many viewers, but would actually be fulfilling the role of a public service broadcaster.
Can you? I mean, BBC 4. And no one watches BBC 4, but it's for people that are interested in culture, and Mark Commode just talking to them one-on-one for an hour. That's what it is.
You only have to look and see the viewing figures of putting the National Theatre, say, on BBC 2, and it's through the roof. People are so interested in that kind of thing, and there is an output for, you know, there is an appetite for things that don't fit into the boxes of BBC 4, and perhaps are worth putting on a national stage. And that's the only way that you can entice people in. You know, people who haven't ever seen...
Is there that they are chasing ratings at the expense of funding arts programs?
Well, they have said that. Tony Hall earlier this month said that they were going to have to cut back on the things that they were providing currently in order to be able to continue to compete, or in order to be able to continue to fund the things that they want to do. Now, you only have to look at things like taking BBC Three off air, or the amount of money that they are putting into even things like sports, minority sports, to see that the things that they're choosing to cut back are the things on the outside edge. They are not going to cut back on Doctor Who. They're not going to cut back on things like Bodyguard. They are going to choose to cut back on there. So it's not a kind of a huge leap to suggest that it will be the things that perhaps don't have that many viewers that they choose to cut back in order to sustain the broadcaster.
Rebecca, isn't this actually sort of beating up the BBC for having a hit? They've always had mainstream entertainment programmes on BBC One. I mean, regardless of whatever arts programmes they're doing elsewhere. And the fact that they're going through a good patch at the moment, Bodyguard, Press, Killing Eve, that's good, isn't it? It means they're spending our money on things people want to watch.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I've got very little patience with this David Attenborough's line of argument on this. It's one that you hear, every now and then it comes up. It's just, I'm as much of a snobby milquetoast as the next, middle-class media person. I've watched my share of documentaries about stained glass windows on BBC Four. But the point being is that, yes, it is a public service provider, but it's not supposed to be feeding you, vegetables you don't want all the time. It does serve a broad spectrum of the public by serving them the things they want to watch proportionately to the amount of people who want to watch it. There's so much culture programming on the BBC, and probably less than 5% of the country is actually actively interested in most of it. I think that people like David Attenborough, understandably, are in a kind of bubble of people where they think this is what lots of people want to watch. There's this big appetite for it. And as Jamie was saying, yes, in some instances there is for bigger and, slightly glitzier end of culture. But fundamentally, the majority of people want to watch the programmes that then go on to become hits. And that's why they're hits.
I think also the kind of argument that they shouldn't be appealing to mainstream audiences, or they should try and pull back on mainstream audiences, actually plays into the hands of everyone else. Advertisers, places like ITV and Sky, they'd really, really love the BBC to not appeal to mainstream audiences, because they've basically just blocked off an advertising revenue for them. So, actually, them continuing to compete with Sky and everything is a good thing. If what we're saying is what we want is part of a market, we want them to be appealing to mainstream viewers.
But it is true that you can sort of see the BBC putting resources into things that are more popular in terms of, if you think about music programmes, take arts, for example, Glastonbury's all over the place, isn't it? When Glastonbury's on, there are 10 different channels running continuously that you can dip into. And yet the BBC also does the proms, and it films Reading Festival. If you wanted to watch every concert that was on there, even though they're filming it, you can't. So I sort of wonder whether there's a disproportionality there, and actually if the argument's just about people want to see it, doesn't matter how many people, are there smarter ways they can cover what they're already doing, is basically what I'm saying.
I think a lot of this BBC public service broadcasting in general just faces a fight for the future, as actually in the words of Tony Hall earlier this year. People consume TV completely differently these days. We're turning into a nation of binge viewers. We don't wait each week for the latest instalment of a show. It's all streaming. It's whether that kind of appointment TV can survive, full stop.
Well, Strictly Come Dancing, massively popular though, isn't it? That is sort of appointment viewing still.
Yeah.
I guess the
but
point
it's
is,
all reality shows and sport. That seems to be the only appointment TV that really has a future, dramas and that. Why wait a week when you can go on Netflix and, watch 10 episodes in a row?
So, back to the brief of the show. Repercussions for all our lives, Jamie Timson.
I think so. I think the thing about the BBC is a question about its future and about what we see the role of the BBC is in 10 years and whether or not we're going to have it. There has been a huge push. There has been a politicisation of the BBC. I think that what Labour wants to do, where to put it on a permanent footing rather than have it on a royal charter, is a good idea, and it needs to be taken away from it having to answer to the government at all. I think is wrong, and I think that at some point in the next 10 years, we're going to have to look at, like Kari said, whether or not it's a digital license fee. So talking about charging people that are using our digital space in the same way that people see the license fee at the moment as a subscription to BBC services. Mm-hmm. But actually it's about the hardware. It's about you paying to be able to receive all of the channels, everything. It's about it's a hardware thing. So if we look at it in the future and think that maybe actually it'll be about a digital license fee will be about people owning the digital space that they're in and providing a kind of public good in that sense. I think the BBC can be a part of that. And
that would involve taking some money away from the BBC making programmes to give them to these other people who are going to be getting a slice of it, though. That's not going to benefit arts programmes on the BBC.
It would be as part of a greater funding of the BBC in general, stopping it trying to answer to, basically saying in the same way that I would argue about the NHS, saying that it's a good thing and a public good and it should be funded accurately and properly across the way, not just in this scenario.
Well, that's the thing. It's being attacked. The BBC is being attacked on both sides, really, by people who are politically opposed to the BBC in its current form and would rather see it kind of melt away into kind of niche interests like you see with PBS in the US, which puts out really great programming but is not by any means a competitor for ratings. And then you've got people who, people like David Attenborough, who obviously do have the best interests of the BBC at heart, but are unwittingly, with this kind of patrician idea that you should be giving people good quality things even if they don't want them, are going to end up pushing it into that same niche space.
What do you see the BBC as in 10 years' time then, if we are looking at this as a turning point, this moment where, our public service broadcaster is really struggling to compete with everyone else, even when they're having a hit, because, as you say, they'll get criticism from populists when they're too niche, and they'll get criticism from cultural figures when they're too populist.
Well, I mean, in their bid to win over younger viewers, the BBC are planning various things. For example, they're going to launch an app that's to appeal to young people, sort of getting them discussing current affairs. There's plans to commission new shows aimed at kids that will be available on broadcast and digital platforms, so that ultimately the BBC becomes more of a digital platform. It can still maintain its identity and its values and everything, but it's just in terms of where it's being shown.
Okay, so no threat to it actually disappearing.
I think it's too much of a British institution.
Rebecca, do you think we'll still have the BBC as we know it now in some form in 10 years' time?
I mean, it doesn't sound like it's looking very good for the likes of BBC Alba, BBC 4, but I think we'll certainly have some kind of core offering in 10 years' time.
There'll be a channel dedicated to satires about China.
Well, that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. We, of course, will still definitely be here in 10 years' time. My thanks to Jamie Timson, Rebecca Gillie and Kari Wilkin. And on this show, we're all about the ratings. So do tell your friends and your colleagues all about us. We are at Week Unwrapped on Twitter, or you can write us a review on Apple Podcasts, which helps other listeners discover us. And if you're new to us, then please do hit subscribe for your weekly fix, and you'll receive our bonus show, Business Unwrapped, our series of stories brought to you by our sponsor, Barclays Corporate Banking. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.